It seems like all of you spoke of some element of it's what the victim would have wanted, or it's what she wanted or he wanted, as part of defenses that you hear in each of these kinds of cases. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us the kinds of experiences you've had in trying to communicate that to a jury as far as what was successful and what you were able to accomplish.
In one neglect death that I prosecuted where that was the defense, the evidence that we found to combat it was the victim's journals. And in her journals, we found her writing about how she wanted medical care and she wanted help, and about how lonely she was. She also talked about being in pain and not wanting to be in pain. We also found an advanced care directive, or a living will, where she was asking for comfort care, which was very inconsistent with what the defendant was doing for her. And then finally, we found out who her medical providers had been and her prior treating physician had been, and we found out that she very actively sought and obtained medical care. So that really helped us to combat that defense.
How about you, Paula, in your financial exploitation cases?
And one of the trials that sticks out in my mind was the defendant was a taxi driver, and he had been introduced to this elderly woman in a facility with advanced Alzheimer's through her former best friend, who was a neighbor of hers before the victim went into a facility. It was the neighbor who hired the taxi driver to take the neighbor to the facility because she couldn't drive, and the three of them would basically spend the day together twice a month. And she made it very clear, the neighbor did, that under no circumstances would this taxi driver ever take the victim out on her own. Well, sure enough, one day she fell ill, so he seized the opportunity to go to the facility because they were expecting him, and he picked up the victim, took her to the bank, and got her to sign a CD surrender form for $98,000. And he managed to walk out of that bank with a cashier's check for $97,000 because they penalized my victim for $1,000 for early withdrawal. At the trial, his defense was, she liked me, she grew attached to me, and she wanted me to use the money for flying lessons. The victim did not testify because she had actually already died, and she didn't testify at the plenary hearing. But I didn't need her to testify because her doctor was brilliant, and he came in and he was able to very clearly explain to the jury that she lacked the capacity to understand what a CD surrender form was, and that even though it had her signature on the form, it's clear to that doctor that she would not have understood and therefore not have been able to give consent to that particular transaction.
And how about you, Kathy, in your sexual abuse cases?
I would echo even more what Paul has said as far as the consent issue. In our sexual assault cases, it's very difficult. The defendant asserts the defense of consent, and yet once you have medical physicians, doctors, nurses who are able to testify and provide the victim's history that shows that she or he may be suffering from dementia or some kind of incapacity, then that is the evidence that quickly combats a consent defense in our sexual assault cases. There are not many other defenses for the defendant to rely on. And so even in cases where you may have a pre-existing relationship, such as a hired personnel, typically what you could show is the victim's habits and how she handled herself, and you have family, neighbors, all of those kinds of things that indicate this was somebody who came and went from her home but was not in a relationship with the victim. All of those things help combat that consent defense in a sexual assault case as well.
What I try to do is show a profile of my victim prior to meeting the suspect, and then how the victim's behavior often changed after meeting the suspect. It sounds a little harsh, but I try to sometimes portray the victim pre-meeting suspect as being somebody who was very frugal, who was not exactly very generous with their money, because after all, most times suspect is going to say as their defense, she gave it to me, he gave it to me, or it was a loan. I also try to focus upon what was it about the suspect that led the victim to believe in the suspect? What kind of statements did the suspect make that engendered some kind of connection with the victim? And I often find that the suspect has just out and out lied to them.
Is there other sorts of information challenges, other sorts of explanation challenges when you think about how difficult these things are to present to a jury?
I try the reverse, Rhonda, because whenever I talk to people around the country about presenting a financial elder exploitation case, typically the first response is, oh, those are difficult. Well, my experience has been just the opposite. It really is. Because my goal is to get my victim onto the witness stand. She's 86 years of age, she's a widow, she's got the most radiant smile, and she got ripped off by this defendant. And she has such jury appeal that it's just getting her on the stand. And the fact that it may be somebody who shows forgetfulness, we can overcome that typically by refreshing their memory, by bringing in external evidence from bank teller, from neighbor, from other people. So typically, the barriers that people put up in reality are not that difficult to overcome. Where we have impairment issues, we can turn to the medical experts. Where we have forgetfulness, we have ways to maybe refresh the memory.